St Giles Files. Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the St Giles Files. This week I'm going to continue from where I left off last week in some respects, that I want to talk about some objects in St Giles that we do not have and some that we might have. So the object that I am going to talk about to introduce us to this topic is the Arm Bone of St Giles. So to give you the background on the arm bone, in the crusading period, a man called William Preston of Gorton decided that he wanted to bring a relic to St Giles Church. Now you have to remember at this point St Giles was Catholic, so having a relic was super important. So William Gorton goes off on crusade, and lo and behold he comes back and says, "Yep, don't worry, I got the arm bone." And he has the press nail built to house it. So that was very nice. He returns with this arm bone, they put it in a glass jar. Now, without trying to spoil it, we don't have any pictures of it, but I will try and find a picture of a similar relic to put online just to give you an idea. So this arm bone sat there for about 100 years. People loved to come and see it as it was a relic. But during the Reformation, the arm bone was lost. Now, there are many different versions of this story. I will tell you one. And the story goes that during the Reformation, relics were pretty badly frowned upon. They were kind of akin to icons, and so the arm bone supposedly was stripped of anything valuable, because obviously it would be encrusted with diamonds and other gems to make it appear as grand as possible. But it was stripped of all that stuff, and it was thrown into the Nor Loch. Now I say into. The Nor Loch was a horrible body of water at that point. All the sewage of the city drained into it. Sorry, for those of you who don't know, the Nor Loch is where Waverley Station is now, the train station, and it used to be a big body of water which was drained originally to put a canal in, but then a train station. Anyway, the arm bone was thrown into, or should I say onto, because supposedly it skittered across the crust that had formed on top of the Nor Loch. So it skittered across, and then they tried to fish it back out and burnt it. Now, this story is often conflated with another story of an effigy of St Giles that exactly the same thing happened to. But what we do know is the arm bone was lost. So that's the St Giles relic. Now, as to what happened to it exactly, we're not sure, because lots of stories have popped up around it. Some people say it was hidden, that it was given to a prominent noble who actually was a Protestant noble. He kept it, and then supposedly he didn't actually give the correct one back. He smuggled the correct relic away somewhere, which is interesting, because then you would think the provenance is removed, and then if you've got two arm bones that look exactly the same, then it's tricky to know which one is the real relic. So by hiding it, he's almost removed its status. Anyway, digression. So after that, the relic is hidden, and my favourite version is of what happened to it is that it was lost in St Giles, and then they were doing some work in the rafters, and they found an arm bone, and this was decided to be the arm bone of St Giles. But the minister at that point didn't want the cathedral to become a hotspot for relic pilgrimage, and so it was all hushed up. I'd say this is one of the more outlandish theories as to what happened to it, but you never know. So that's the story on the arm bone of St Giles, an object that we used to have, certainly. We might still have if it's lost somewhere in the building, but probably don't have. Now, interestingly, when I was doing the research for this episode, I typed in arm bone into our online archive, and a story that popped up was the Arm Bone of Montrose. Now, all the stories I've heard previously have said that Montrose was executed, quartered, all the bits of his body were sent to the 7 cities, so the four limbs were sent around, and the trunk and the head were sent, although I'm not sure what the 7th bit would be. Anyway, the other side note to this is interesting, that Aberdeen was expecting a leg and got an arm, and the summary being that it wasn't done very well, the sending of his body parts, I suppose. Now, after the restoration of the monarchy, Charles II, it's said that Montrose's remains were interred in St Giles under great ceremony and great splendour and grandeur and all these things. and I had always taken that to mean that they'd managed to get all of his body. However, this story would suggest otherwise. It's a story by a previous minister of St Giles, and rather than trying to summarise it myself, I thought I would just read it out because it's quite funny. So it goes like this. It's from Charles Waugh, who was an old minister. In the spring of 1930, a Yorkshire gentleman, Mr. J.W. Morkill, offered to give what was alleged to be the right forearm and hand of the great Marquess to St Giles Cathedral so that it might find a resting place in Montrose's tomb. Side note from me here, Charles Waugh is going to refer to Montrose's tomb as a tomb. I think I would prefer to refer to it as a memorial which has the potential to have Montrose remains beneath. Anyway, side note over. I felt that the views of the Duke of Montrose ought to be ascertained and respected. Here he means the current Duke at that time, and was unwilling to initiate acceptance of Mr. Morkill's generous offer until I knew that it would meet the Duke's approval. The Duke, however, told me that he would rather see the relic in St Giles than at his ancestral home in Drimmen. So, in due course, Mr. Morkill travelled to Edinburgh to discuss the matter with me. He brought the relic with him, and it was left in my charge until things could be finalised. The strange macabre object reposed in a long, narrow brass casket, and the experts who examined it were quite certain that it had never been buried in the earth. The arm is described in a catalogue of a Leeds museum, printed in 1712, only 62 years after the Montrose execution. It was, says the catalogue, positively asserted to be the celebrated Marquis of Montrose, whose quarters were disposed of to the several cities in Scotland. Whence this was brought. Towards the middle of the 18th century, it came into the possession of the ardent Jacobite John Graham of Woodhall in the Yorkshire parish of Hemingburgh. By this doughty upholder of the House of Stuart it was treasured, together with the sword which had belonged to the Marquess, with a reverence as great as that which a pious Catholic accords the relics from saints. From Mr. John Graham's death in 1773 until the arm came into the hands of Mr. Morkill in 1881, its history is completely authenticated. In St Giles, as one is made frequently aware, the minister and the kirk session have not always the same liberty of action as in an ordinary parish church. Often they have to take into account public opinion, for St Giles is a national monument as well as a parish church. As the offer to St Giles of the arm of Montrose began to get known, it soon became clear that others outside the cathedral authorities were very much concerned. Antiquarians and historians got busy, and both members of the kirk session and of the managing board were made aware that the interment of the arm in St Giles might arouse considerable feeling in important quarters. Many views, for and against, were expressed by authoritative persons. Personally, I had been a bit uneasy at first. Now I was very anxious. The tomb of Montrose in St Giles is one of the most hallowed and revered of Scotland's historic possessions. It was not unnatural that many people should have grave misgivings about the propriety of opening the tomb and placing the arm within it, unless there was absolute and irrefutable proof of the arm's authenticity. The conclusion was reluctantly reached that we could not risk giving offence to a considerable section of informed opinion, so I had to tell Mr. Morkill that we greatly regretted that we could not accept his offer. Mr. Morkill then, with a gracious gesture, presented the relic to the Duke of Montrose. It is now preserved at the family seat at Drimmen. So that was a second story that I hadn't expected to find about a missing arm bone, and I suppose it's quite a nice story that this arm bone, regardless of whether it is real or not, is preserved somewhere and has a nice story attached to it, which I suppose speaks to something of last week's podcast. I thought what would be nice to do then as a result of those two stories is to look at other objects that are not in St Giles and give you an idea of things that can be seen elsewhere. So I had a little look through our archive of everything that we've been able to find that is St Giles related that might not be in St Giles, and there were a few objects that I thought were quite fun. Now, I mentioned the pulpit of oak said to be from St Giles Cathedral in the 17th century. That was supposedly John Knox's pulpit. One of the other things that I quite like, so I mentioned Haddo's Hole in one of the podcasts, I can't remember which one now, which was a small prison for Covenanters, which has since been removed. But there is an iron gate, which would have been the entrance to Haddo's Hole in the National Museum, as is the window grating from what would have been Haddo's Hole. Also in the National Museum is the clothing of one of the Knights of the Order of the Thistle from the opening of the Order of the Thistle in 1911, including coat, breeches, waistcoat, hat, shoe, singular, box, stocking, suspenders, shirt, collar, shirt. Oh, 2 shirts there by the looks of things. Oh no, sorry, the first one was a shift. Cuff, link, stud, glove, singular, bow tie, sword, scabbard, hanger, sword. Oh, there is 2 swords. There are 2 swords. So that's his clothes from that opening. Another one is another object. Is a pair of soles. So the shoes or soles found in the Murray vault. So that was when they were digging out the Earl of Murray's vault in the 19th century. Interesting pair of soles. Another item is the silver presentation trowel with white handle, possibly of ivory, used for laying the foundation stone of the Thistle chapel in St Giles, 6th of November 1909. One of my favourite objects, actually, is the Order of Service for the National Health Service in St Giles, Edinburgh, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the NHS in Scotland, 5th of July 1998. Lovely. A final one, again, which I know one of our old colleagues, a guy called Andrew, really liked, a black and white photo of Wendy Wood demonstrating outside St Giles Cathedral in May 1957 with a placard stating, "End the Union now." So those are just some objects that the National Museum has. And then I know the council museums have loads of different stuff from St Giles, including our old clock and some of our old bells. A really nice fellow called Nico showed me all the things that they have there, and said there was loads of other stuff that he hadn't managed to lay his hands on, but was certainly knocking around. The point of me telling you about those objects is to push out the wider discussion. Now, as I'm vaguely aware, in the past I have said, I don't intend to answer this question, and then I try and answer it. This one I certainly don't intend to answer, but I will certainly pose it. And the wider discussion is just a small one for this week, is where do we keep all of this history? I remember when I first found out about copyright libraries. Copyright libraries exist in Oxford University and Cambridge University, in Wales, in Scotland, so that they, and in Dublin. And they're libraries that theoretically can request a copy of every single book ever published with an ISBN number in English. So they're kind of never-ending, expanding libraries. And I always used to wonder, what will happen, or still do, what will happen in 1,000 years when tons and tons of books are published? And I suppose, fortunately, we're moving to a more online publishing, and so maybe that will be the saviour for those libraries. But history is never going to stop. History won't move online. And so the fact that the National Museum has all those tiny things, especially the gates from Haddo's Hole, which are certainly really, really important objects, but eventually they're going to have to put those somewhere. And I suppose that the thing that I wonder is, history will keep happening. There's no doubt of that. And so where do we keep it all? Where do we keep the bits that haven't become irrelevant, because I don't think they ever become irrelevant, but certainly have become less relevant to the people of today? So, for example, the Covenant is still very relevant to us because it's only, 400 years ago. But let's say another 400 years from now, if it becomes less relevant, where will we keep it? And I suppose I wonder where we will keep the small bits of ephemera, for example, like the Order of Service for the National Health Service. Whilst that's very relevant to us today, still very temporally relevant, maybe in 100, 150, 200, 1,000 years, the foundation of the NHS will become less important. And so do we bother keeping that history? Does someone decide to throw things away, or does it take on different relevance in that a paper document of that sort will become very scarce by that point? So the reason we keep it is different to the reason that people in the future keep it. I suppose I wonder where we'll keep all of this history. Anyway, as promised, not so much a resolution of an issue, more of a pose of a question. So that's the start of the discussion for you guys and the end of the podcast for me today. See you all soon. Bye. The same postscript here as usual. As you can hear, I am still doing this on my own. Lucky you guys. But we've all been out of action a bit longer than I think we originally anticipated, and St Giles is still topping up the 20% of our staff's furlough. But obviously we're still making no income from visitors whatsoever. So if you can help out and you have enjoyed the podcast, please do. Just head over to the website. It's really easy. There's loads of donate buttons everywhere. So it'd be much appreciated if you can help out. Okie doke, that's it then. Thanks, bye.